that kei a koe te rangatiratanga. You are the rangatira of your own truth, of your own experience, of your own knowledge. So just very, very warm aroha feel-free to thank you so much for bringing this.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tāmai nei ki tēnei hui, ka nui tui atu nei ki a koutou. Tēnā koe kere, tēnā koe mō ki a au, tēnei rā, ka tino nui ki a ki nā kai whakahari o tēnei kura, ka tino nui te mihi ki a koutou, ka tino hari ko tēnākou ki tā pōkinga mai, ke waimenu ki a koutou o tēnei hui tēnei rā, nō reira. Nui te mi atu nei ki a koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā katoa.
Hedley, have we got the lapel on?
Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you.
Ko te mihi atu nei ki a koutou katoa, ko tai mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. So I just said that again because the recorder didn't pick it up. My apologies. We're getting a bit of echo. Is that a problem? No? Okay. We're going to be talking about some very sensitive issues today, and we're going to be talking about some very painful issues. So if you don't know about this number, 1737, I've got some to give you to remind you that this is a number that you can either text or call if you need to discuss anything in relationship to today's seminar, but also in general, if you've got any concerns or issues you need to discuss with somebody, this number is available. Who's never seen this before? So you're the ones who are going to get them. Hands up again. There. One here. Here. Oops, sorry. 3 up the back, and I'm running out. That's it. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Now, and I should be wearing one as well, but oh, I've run out. Sorry. Oh, I'll be. Okay, thank you. Now, I'll give you this at the end because it is, some of you may notice that when Dr. Bloomfield gives his daily announcements, he is generally wearing one. And it's a very effective way of letting people know that we do have services for this very, this topic that is often very traumatic and stressful for people. So I'm going to be talking today about suicide. Kia ora, Philippa. Nau mai haere mai, ki a koe. And I'm going to touch on some of the issues around the invisibility of suicide in our community and as they apply to people who identify or do not identify but might be described as takatāpui, and then what are some of the barriers and some of the actions. But before I go any further, I really would like to send a big shout out to some people here. Philippa Howden-Chapman, who was my supervisor when I came to this university over 20 years ago. And in a sense, I hold a bit of a record, I think, today. We're setting a record today because it's taken 20 years to be invited back. But it's great to see one of my supervisors still here. So thank you for coming, Philippa. And 20 years later, I'm grateful to all your support in the work that I did. I also want to give another shout out to 2 very important people sitting in the very front row here. Linda Pearson and Kylie Jones, who were here in Wellington at the very beginning of the HIV epidemic. And Linda and Kylie nursed and cared for all the people in the early days of the epidemic. And Linda has subsequently gone off and shared her skills and her expertise with people around the world. She's just returned to New Zealand from having worked with Médecins Sans Frontières in countries as diverse as China, Myanmar, Somalia, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and I could go on and on. But she's a wonderful example of a person who was trained here in New Zealand, developed expertise, and then shared it with the rest of the world. Kylie has stayed in Wellington. She's been faithful to the people in Wellington, but we have a very strong friendship and bond as a result of the work that they did in HIV. So thank you, Linda, for being so dedicated. Thank you, Kylie, for being so dedicated. And thank you for coming along today. So I was brought up on the banks of this river, the Waiho, and I was born in a little town called Turua. And we didn't know much about apostrophes and spelling and punctuation, but we learned a lot about whānau connection. And I'm one of 5 children. My mother had 5 children under the age of 30. And she had 2 beautiful sisters, my aunts, Auntie Betty, Auntie Rangi, and my mother was called Molly. For those of you who don't know where Turua is, but you know where to put your apostrophe, but you don't know your geography all that well, Turua, oops, sorry, is there. We're 8 miles south of Thames. Nobody knows where Turua is, so I'm used to explaining to people that I was brought up in a little village 8 miles south of Thames, because most people know where Thames is. I grew up with very strong memories of a woman called Molly Turner. My mother, as I said, was called Molly, and Molly Turner, we were told from when we were very small, walked into the water at Big Bay. I'm never quite sure whether it's Big Bay or Orua Bay, but she walked into the water and drowned herself. And for me growing up, that was the very first memory I have of somebody taking their own life. I was never told why she did it. I don't know any of the circumstances, but that name has stayed with me all my life. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who have very strong memories of having lost someone to suicide. So I'd just like you to close your eyes for 5 minutes or for 5 seconds and just bring that person's memory to the talk today. So Molly Turner drowned in the Manuka Harbour, and Manuka Harbour was well known because it's one of the entry points into Auckland. And on the 7th of February in 1863, the Orpheus attempted to sail into that harbour. And it has a very treacherous bar. And in order to cross that bar, you have to approach it at the right time and at the right angle. Unfortunately, the captain had locked the only person he knew who knew how to get across the bar into the brig for having deserted. And as a result, they didn't have the knowledge they needed to prevent the maritime disaster, which turned out to be the biggest maritime disaster in New Zealand's history. Over 160 people perished of a crew of about 200 or 300. And they needn't have perished because the boat, the tragedy happened within sight of the shore. And if the sailors on the boat had known how to swim, they could have swum to shore. In fact, a few did. But for me, this is an example of what we're going to be talking about today. If the people on that ship had had the right skills and the right knowledge and the right training, there would have been far fewer deaths. And the same applies, I believe, when we're talking about suicide in New Zealand. If people have the right skills, the right training, the right knowledge, then we would see fewer deaths than currently occur by suicide. So I want to start with this image as a way of illustrating some of the issues I want to talk about today. in my lifetime, I've known probably more than most people who've died by suicide. I'm just bringing their names up here, and each time I see one of these names, I can remember particular details. And all of those, except the two at the top, are people who belong to the communities that we're going to be talking about today. Some people say LGBT, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to describe them as takatāpui. The last person, Shane, is the person in that photo. And this photo was the last photo taken of him before he died, and he's surrounded here by his mother and his father. It was his 40th birthday. They'd been out celebrating that night with his parents in a gay nightclub, and he died before the sun came up the next day. So this is a very evocative image, and it also is indicative of the fact that often we don't know very much about the person who takes their own life. And for me, Shane epitomizes this particular issue. As I said, I came to this university 20-something years ago, and I was fortunate to be able to study this topic, trans-Tasman migration and Māori in the time of AIDS. And I thought it was appropriate to delve a little bit into what I studied then, because it resonates with what we're going to be talking about today. In the course of that study, I met some wonderful people. This person in particular, whose name most of you probably know, her name is Carmen, and she at the time was living in Sydney. And I love this image because you can see she surrounded herself by images of herself. And for me, she epitomizes a person who has a very strong identity and understanding of who she is and where she fits in the world. And that provides people with significant strength and resilience. She was an inveterate letter writer. And when I was living in Auckland, she would send me these beautiful letters, and you'll notice that she made her own stamps. And as a way of ensuring that she would live beyond her own death. And some of you will also know that she is depicted on the traffic lights around Cuba Street. If you haven't noticed, have a look at them. Yeah, Carmen, and there's a cafe called Floriditas, and there's a little statue of her. So Carmen created she left a real legacy, and she was a person who was extremely confident and knew where she was going in the world. So she was a wonderful person that I met in the course of this study. But I just want to quickly read you a couple of little excerpts from my thesis, because they lead us into our discussion that's going to follow. Ruth, not her real name, is in her late 40s and spent a year and a half in Australia. She was rejected by her whānau when she decided to accept and acknowledge that she was transgender. Her memories of her time in Australia are filled with incidents such as racial abuse, exclusion from venues, drug overdoses, and violence. She attempted to discard her Māori identity completely, but found this impossible. Even today, she believes that she suffers from long-term negative consequences from this process. And the second person I just want to tell you about is a transgender woman called Simone. She's 40, lived in Sydney for 2 years during her mid-20s. From an early age, she was rejected by her whānau for being transgender, and she had to rely on her skills and wits to make ends meet. At times, this has meant having to do sex work in order to earn an income, something that she would rather not have done. It has not always been easy for her to find what she calls a proper job. In Sydney, she managed to find bar work, but even this was not without dangers, such as threats of violence and death from corrupt police and operators. In fact, within hours of arriving in Sydney, she was assaulted by police who racially and physically abused her. 2 weeks later, she was abducted by 3 men who took her to an isolated part of Sydney where they raped and physically violated her. So these are just 2 examples of some of the terrible trauma that takatāpui and especially transgender people suffer as a result of who they are. I just want to take you back 25 years. And I just want to tell you about something that happened to me then and which has stayed with me ever since. So it's 1995. That's me, believe it or not. And I was a policy analyst at Punikokere, the Ministry of Māori Development. And one day I was invited to attend a policy seminar at the Ministry of Youth Affairs. And it was about youth suicide. And as the discussion unfolded, I had the audacity to say to the person presenting, so what about lesbian and gay people? Surely they're at greater risk of suicide. And the person presenting said, no, absolutely no evidence of that. And that was the first time I encountered silence with regard to this issue. So that's 25 years ago. And I was told that lesbian and gay people were not at increased risk and that I should not even talk about it. And that was the end of the discussion. The Ministry of Youth Affairs is now called the Ministry of Youth Development. And I would hope, in fact, I'm sure, that we would get a far different response from the one I got in 1995. It caused me to do some research around this issue. And as I was preparing for this seminar, it occurred to me that I was dealing a lot with death. And I was dealing with the death of people that I know, of contemporaries. And so here we have Kathleen Quinlivan, who passed away earlier this year. Kathleen Quinlivan was a professor at the University of Canterbury who did an immense amount of work around gay and lesbian people in education. This man on the left is the partner of the policy analyst at the Ministry of Youth Affairs at the seminar that I attended 25 years ago. So there was an interesting connection there. And I guess as one gets older, you get to make more and more connections and your networks become more and more extensive. And from living in Wellington, you get to know a lot of people. And this is really, for me, an example of how that has happened. I knew Kathleen well, and I didn't know, but at the time, but in recent years, she published a book exploring contemporary issues in sexuality education with young people. So she was doing work around this very issue, yet there was a person at the Ministry of Youth Affairs saying, no, there's no evidence. And for me, this is a really good example how lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex people get silenced. We get pushed to the margins. We're not part of the discussion. And about the same time, Kathleen had a colleague whose name is Shane Town, and he was at the Victoria University, University of Wellington, Victoria University, and he wrote a thesis based on research entitled, Is It Safe to Come Out Now? Sexuality in the Education of 10 Gay Men. Now, if you want to read that thesis, it's in the Victoria University Library, and it documents word by word by word the challenges and the traumas to which gay and lesbian students are subjected on a regular basis. Think back to the person who said that no, sexuality is not an issue in youth suicide. Yet at the same time, we had this research happening. There was media attention to the issue. These are headlines from newspapers about a gay and lesbian support group in a school here in Wellington. Principal says no to gay teacher group. Students were being offered the support and the counselling they need, but they were being the teachers were being shut down. Gay teachers concerns rejected. School, no place for role models. And here's what the principal of the school says: consequently, as principal of Hutt Valley High School, I will not permit the body identifying itself as Glee to establish a group within the school, to counsel students within the school, or to promote its particular interests within the school. So I'm putting all this before you because I want you to realize that there is a huge history that goes with the discrimination and stigma that we see today and which contributes to the high rates of suicide that we currently see in this country. At the back of the thesis, there is this whole extensive list of research that was happening at the time that that person made that comment. There's research that was happening that showed quite clearly that LGBT people were at greater risk of suicide and the subsequent mental health issues that many of us face. So it was all documented. It was there for people to see. But I guess there's that saying, there are none so blind as those who cannot see. And that's what I encountered at the Ministry of Youth Affairs. Okay, in recent times, we've had the review of the mental health and addiction services in New Zealand. And I've just drawn out 3 little snippets of information from this thesis, from this report. New Zealand's high rate of youth suicide are a national shame. Terrible thing for Stephen to articulate that. Our persistently high suicide rates are of major concern. Our approach to suicide prevention and the support available to people after a suicide is patchy and under-resourced. We have it there in black and white. Across the spectrum of poor mental health are inequalities in mental health and addiction outcomes. In addition to Māori, disproportionately poorer mental health is experienced by Pacific and youth, people with disabilities, the rainbow LGBTIQ community, prison population and refugees. So there it is. We have it stated. It couldn't be more blatant. It couldn't be more clearly articulated. And I guess for us as a country, the question is, well, what are we going to do about this? Do we want to be standing here in 25 years' time and there's been no progress, there's been no change? I don't, and I'm sure most of us here in the room don't. So what's happening? I'm going to go through this quite quickly now because it's some of the main points. So takatāpui, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origins of this term. It appears firstly in the dictionary of the Māori language, which was put together in 1834, I think they started in 1845. I can never quite establish the correct date. However, this man Williams came to New Zealand. For those of you who don't know the story, came to New Zealand, one of the first things he did, like all good colonizers, was document everything. So he wrote down every word he came across and then gave it a meaning. And he came across this word, takatāpui, which means, in his definition, an intimate companion of the same sex. And he gave an example in the dictionary of tiki being the takatāpui of two tanakai. Most people know the story of Hinemoa and two tanakai, the romantic version of a man and a woman from opposite tribes who came together and fell in love and transgressed all those tribal parameters. But nobody really talks about two tanakai having a male friend of the same sex. And that word was rediscovered in recent times, and now it's used in a more contemporary context. So how do we know that people had a same-sex attraction in pre-colonial times? Well, we know the early settlers entered into same-sex relationships with local Māori. We know that same-sex relationships were accepted and condoned by Māori communities. Judith Binney wrote an article about a man called Mr. Yates, who had multiple relationships with Māori men. There were rumours arising from his relationship on a voyage that he undertook from England out to New South Wales. And if you go to the Mitchell Library in Australia, there is an extensive repertoire of archival material that talk about his relationships with men. So for me, that's a fairly significant indicator that same-sex relationships were accepted and condoned within Māori communities. Here's Mr. Yates, rather stern-looking man. And here's the young man who was in a relationship with him, as we would call it, but he was described as well, there are some quite extensive documents that talk about the relationship and also the behavior between the two of them. One of the things they did often, according to this young man, was mutual masturbation, and it's been documented. He wrote a love letter to Mr. Yeat when Mr. Yeat went back to England, saying how much he missed him. And when Mr. Yeat was finally banished back to England in disgrace, the local people in the village where he'd been living for a couple of years amongst the local Māori community took a gun and shot his horse. And in the early days of colonisation and settlement, horses would have been an extremely valuable asset, but they were so horrified by the incidents that had taken place around Mr. Yeat that they killed his horse. If you travel around some of the museums in the world, you'll come across some beautiful Māori artifacts. These are photos I took at a museum, the Museum of Anthropology in Italy, in Florence in Italy, and I took them because they depict some rather beautiful examples of sexual diversity, and missionaries and other people might lead you to believe that there was not sexual diversity, when in actual fact it's depicted in a way that indicates significant pleasure. This is a really interesting, this is a really interesting piece of work, and it shows two people in sexual egress, I think that's what you call it. And it's depicted in good Western style with the man at the top and the woman on the bottom. But in actual fact, it was carved as a ridgepole that would have been gone across the middle of a whare, and neither the man nor the woman would be on top. But because this is displayed in a westernized museum, they put the man on the top, and they do significant damage to the original ideas and thoughts of the work. We know that people with the same-sex attraction existed in other indigenous cultures. This is a famous image from Native American, from North America, a man called Wiwa. People like this were highly revered in Native American culture. I'm going to start going fast now. So the word takatapui first appeared in 1994. Some of us are old enough to remember a place called the Public Health Commission, and they were responsible for... Pardon? Oh, you did? Okay, well, you probably are familiar with this report. But the Public Health Commission generated, over a very short period of time, some really important documents. And were they not there? Well, I don't know whether these sorts of things would have seen the light of day. But we should be grateful to Professor Skegg, who was instrumental in setting up the commission. And so there was a report onto the health needs of Māori gay men, 1994. So this is about the same time as I was being told to be quiet at the Ministry of Youth Affairs. The phrase takatapui is referred to by some Māori homosexual men in preference to gay, bisexual, transgender, or who have sex with other males, or who by orientation are physically attracted to other males. It is therefore broader in scope than the phrase Māori gay men, but clearly includes the latter. And the word gay was sort of taken over by people trying to understand what was happening within the context of HIV and AIDS. And it ignored the fact that people had also a cultural identity, whereas the word takatapui embraces culture and sexuality, sexual identity. We've gone over that, so I'll quickly... Oh, so the last point I want to make, the last 2 points, the term acknowledges the cultural and sexual components of one's identity, evidence that it provides protection against negative health outcomes. I was very fortunate enough to finish my doctorate to get involved in a project called the Māori Sexuality Project. We conducted interviews, focus groups with numerous people, Māori people throughout the country. They talked about sexual diversity from previous generations. So as you know, we have a very strong oral tradition where stories get passed down through generations. And we even had people in this project who were able to recollect stories told to them by their ancestors, by their grandparents and great-grandparents. And they told us that there was widespread acceptance of sexual diversity in pre-settlement days and pre-colonisation days. In fact, Māori society embraced difference rather than rejected it. So we came to the conclusion, and this is not new to people, that colonisation imposed narrow definition of sexuality, which led to exclusion of people because of their sexuality. So in contemporary times, the word takatapui encompasses sexual and cultural components of one's identity. It's used by men, it's used by women, it's used by transgender. and it is preferred term to those such as gay, lesbian, transsexual, and there is increasing usage within Māori society, within the Māori community. Now, my father's name was Trevor. So my mum was Molly, my father was Trevor. And I was very surprised to come across this website, which does tremendous work in terms of suicide prevention in the United States. So I had to show you this. It is the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people. It is incredibly encouraging to see that the numbers have dropped in recent times in the US. However, they still see disparities in suicidality across sexual identity among high school students. And the piece at the bottom, almost a quarter of lesbian, gay, and bisexual students reported a suicide attempt in the past year, nearly 4 times the rate of their heterosexual peers. So we're dealing with a really serious health and public health issue. We know that the transgender population is make up a significant portion of our community. Studies done by Terry Ann Clark and colleagues show that of all the students in the Youth 12 survey that they conducted, 1.2% identify as transgender. And an important part of that is that most have not told anybody about it, but they did disclose it in their anonymous survey. So that is an indication of some of the challenges we face when we try to understand this whole scenario. Johns et al. Showed that 1.8% of their respondents identified as transgender, and 1.3% of the Shields et al. Study indicated that they were transgender. So these are indicators of the numbers of people who identify as transgender, and as you will agree, these are not insignificant numbers of people that we're talking about. So what are some of the barriers that takatapui encounter? Well, there's a whole list there. Rejection by whānau, I've already told you about that from my doctoral studies. Lack of self-acceptance. People find it hard to accept themselves because of the negative pressures out there in the community. Negative feelings about sexuality or gender. Dissatisfaction about how they look. Higher rates of depression, mental illness, other forms of mental illness, anxiety. And homophobia, biphobia, transphobia is still highly prevalent in our society. Conforming to sexual gender norms, managing sexual and gender identities across life's domains, being unable to talk, and other crises that affect all of us in our lives. My partner showed me an article from the Sydney Morning Herald that was published this morning about a very, very well-known, prominent rugby player, and I meant to put it in here, but I forgot. And the headline was, "Killing myself felt like it was much easier than accepting myself." And that typifies what it must be like for so many people who struggle to understand and accept their identity. So, what are some of the protective factors that takatapui, that come from being takatapui? Well, family connectedness, it's no surprise. But if your family rejects you for being transgender, you don't have access to that beneficial element. The second important component is if you're at school, a teacher caring about a student who's transgender makes a world of difference. Even just one teacher that shows a level of understanding and acceptance can make a phenomenal difference to that person's life. One person caring, be it an auntie, a grandparent, one other person makes a world of difference. I am one of 39 grandchildren, and everybody said that I was grandma's favorite, and I think I was. But I also think that for me, it was something that saved me from feeling different, from feeling that life was difficult. I was able to have access to the love and support of my grandmother. And I know that grandparents play a really big role in the lives of their grandchildren, especially those who might end up being transgender, lesbian, gay. And then safety at school is a really important issue, and it's such a simple thing. The principal of Lower Hutt High School didn't provide a safe environment for his students. I used to be a teacher in West Auckland, and one of the biggest schools in New Zealand was Avondale College. And the principal of that school in those days said that they didn't have any gay students in their school. This was a school of over 2,000 students, none of whom was gay. So when people make those sorts of blanket statements, you know that it's a very unsafe place for LGBT students. Quickly want to finish by talking about a project that I'm very fortunate to be leading. We're going to be conducting an investigation of coronial reports. So as you know, as I'm sure you know, coroner's investigations are a really important component of understanding why a person has died in circumstances that are unknown. So a coroner will hold an inquiry to investigate the circumstances of the death. They'll make a declaration, and the intention of that is that it will help to prevent further deaths of that nature. So a hearing can happen either on papers, when the coroner will look at all the papers related to the person's life and then make a determination. But sometimes the coroner will go the extra mile and conduct an inquest when they will bring together all the people who knew the person who has died. And that, in my eyes, in my view, gives a much more thorough understanding of the person's life and circumstances. But it doesn't happen very often. That's called an inquest. Now, if you look at the Coronial Service for New Zealand website, there is this statement: families can be involved as much as they want to be. One of my previous employments was working as an advisor to the Suicide Mortality Review Committee. And I know for a fact that this is not always observed, that families do not get as involved as they want to, and there are multiple reasons why that might happen. So there are limitations with regard to coroners' investigations into suicide. With regard to Māori, the data is extremely limited. Like many data sets, the focus is on vulnerabilities and risk. So data sets don't necessarily provide opportunities to show and understand the protective factors that are part of people's lives. There's nothing about cultural attachment. There's nothing about whakapapa, which is a protective mechanism for Māori. There's nothing about understanding or using te reo Māori. We don't know whether, well, we may know whether they went to a kura or not, but often it's not documented. And we don't know whether they participate in kapahaka, which we know provides significant cultural protection for people who participate in activities of that nature. So for takatapui, what are the issues with regard to coronial investigations? Well, we know that takatapui have high rates of mental distress, stigma, discrimination, and bullying. It still occurs on a widespread basis. SOGI data is filtered through the eyes of other people. SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity expression. So people of multiple sexual orientation, gender identity expressions often have somebody else interpreting their lives, and that other person may have no understanding at all about the issues that they confront being a member of the SOGI community. There's no record for somebody who might be doubting or questioning their sexuality. And we know that we all go through periods of questioning who we are. And if we come up against negative factors and influences, that makes it even more of a struggle and even more difficult. So there's no way of capturing a person's emerging sense of self-identity. And the records don't tell us about whether they were protected by other members or adults in their lives, such as parents or teachers, who can make a huge difference. So, if I take you back to He Ara Oranga, there were 40 recommendations in this report. Number 33 says there needs to be a review of the processes for investigating deaths by suicide. There is recognition that the coronial investigation process needs readjustment, needs adapting, needs to be fixed, needs to be better than it is. If it's going to carry out its function of suicide prevention, we need a much more thorough and robust system of investigating coronial of investigating deaths by suicide. I'm pleased to announce that with my colleague and friend here and a number of other people, we've been successful in getting a small amount of funding from the Health Research Council to investigate the role of whānau in coronial processes and rangatahi suicide prevention. And the purpose of the investigation will be to understand how coroners arrive at a determination of rangatahi has died by suicide, barriers and facilitators to whānau engagement. What are the views of whānau about coronial processes and their engagement with them? What types of engagement would they like and how, and what are the benefits for them? So we're going to look at the ways in which whānau are involved in coronial investigations into suicide to understand the extent to which they're involved, how they might be better involved, how they might be involved in a way that was beneficial for the whānau in terms of suicide prevention. These are the investigators with whom I have the great honour of working. Kiri is one of our investigators, and we come from diverse backgrounds and experiences and understanding, and hopefully we will be able to bring together important information that will make a difference in terms of suicide, but also in terms of understanding how the judicial processes can be refined and amended to produce better outcomes for rangatahi. So I just want to finish by acknowledging my friend Carmen. She was probably one of the most photographed people in the world. And as I said, she's now been immortalised on the traffic lights in Cuba Street. If you haven't seen these traffic lights, have a look. You'll remember who Carmen is. Carmen passed away, unfortunately, sadly, some years ago. And I just want to finish with that image because this is the sort of family that we would all like to grow up in, knowing that we are accepted and that we can be who we want to be and that we don't suffer rejection and stigma and discrimination. He mihi, tino nui kia tātou, katoa. Thank you very much. Te here waka. Any questions, comments? We've got 10 minutes. Yeah, look. I used to be a school teacher, and I've learned that you ask a question, and then you've got to wait at least 5 seconds before someone answers. So we're up to about 2 seconds, I think. 3, 4. I'm sure there's a question. There you go.
What are your thoughts about the difference between
it's my understanding that there's a difference between bisexual individuals and gay and lesbian individuals in terms of suicide risk, that specifically that people who are bisexual are at greater risk. And then, of course, people who are gender expansive and transgender are at greater risk still. I've always been struck by this because I'm interested in your thoughts about why bisexual people have been identified as being at high risk of suicide compared to their gay and lesbian peers.
Well, I can talk from my personal experience, so, and it may not be authoritative, so don't hold me to it. But Carmen, for example, knew exactly who she was. And I think a person who has a really strong sense of their identity is probably less at risk than others. They're still at risk, and I don't really feel comfortable using that term, but I think having a strong sense of one's identity provides you with significant protection. And I know this is tricky because I have known people, and I'll base it on that, but this doesn't apply to me. I've known people who might say, they question their identity and they'll say, oh, I'm bisexual. And a few years later, they'll say, well, actually, I'm lesbian or I'm gay. And for those people, and I'm not saying the same for everyone, those people, it's a transition. And that period of uncertainty may expose people to significant risk. Now, I know that probably is not acceptable for some people who have a very strong sense of their bisexuality, and I would agree with that. But if accepting that your bisexuality and being strong and resolute in that way, that probably reduces your exposure to vulnerability. And so that's a bit of a roundabout way of answering that. Linda. Oh, microphone.
Thank you. I noticed you talk about protective factors and not resilience. Was there a reason for that, or do you see a difference between the importance of resilience versus protective factors, particularly in relation to Māori culture?
Yes, there's a lot of debate around the term resilience, and I hesitate to use that term. I think I used it once because I couldn't think of an alternative. But resilience suggests that I've managed okay, why can't you? And the origins of the term come from the focus of disciplines such as psychology on the individual. And so therefore it's difficult to translate that to a community setting. And if we were to apply it to an Indigenous community, for example, there's potential for people to say, well, what's wrong with you lot? Why can't you get your act together? And ignoring all the other extraneous factors that impact upon the well-being of a community. So yeah, I do. Some people prefer the term resistance to resilience. There's a question over here, and then over there.
Hello, I really enjoyed your talk. My question is this. Oh, by the way, I should have introduced myself. Mary Moore, I'm a nurse. How about spirituality as a protective force?
I think that's probably a really important aspect. If you've got a vision for the future and can see a direction, then it comes from spirituality. I think that probably does provide protection.
by way of a response to you. When I think about wairua or spirituality a la being Māori, I think about whakapapa. I think about the long journey from the thought of us to the physical reality of us. So we came out of, this is what my grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother taught her, that we came out of a dream and a vision. And that's how we came to be here. And we came out of a great, great love story. And that's how we came to be here. And so as part of whakapapa, we are surrounded, our wairua, in the spiritual and physical realms by people to whom we are connected, by blood, by ancestry. And so at the heart of suicide prevention, in my belief, is the acknowledgement of the totality of what comprises us in terms of identity, in terms of cultural roots, in terms of the long generations of people that have gone before us and that are a dream in the making, those who are yet to come after us. So whakapapa is a core, you know, we call it in policy and research, and I've been involved in suicide prevention. Mahi wrote the first ever Indigenous suicide prevention strategy in the world called Kia Piki Te Oro Te Tai Tamariki. Got into a big fight with dear old youth affairs over it and every other institution. But that was the product of a whole lot of people. When we're fortunate enough to hold the pen on policy development, hold the pen on research, or now operate the keyboard for research, we don't do that on our own. We do that on strength of our whakapapa and who we are and our stories. And so our stories are really, really, really critical, and a critical part of suicide prevention, of understanding, of healing as families, of healing as whakapapa. So if you look around this room, this lecture theatre, and you see big gaps, so just pretend we're all one whānau. What suicide does is it creates the gaps in our whakapapa. And it's very, well, there's no fixing those gaps in a physical reality, but there is a fixing of those gaps, of the loss of those who are gone, and the disconnections and eruptions to whakapapa that suicide creates are wairua. Because a life lost, a person who ends their life by suicide has not gone to hell, has reconnected with our whakapapa, our wairua.
Yeah, one more. Up there and then you. Sandra, the young woman up the back, and then Sandra. Oh, down here, over here.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
I was wondering what your thoughts are with regards to gay pride when it could feel potentially alienating for people who feel a lot of shame with regards to their sexuality.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. But I know that shame is a terrible thing that many people live with. And I know that having participated in events of that nature, that I come away feeling edified and fortified. And my overwhelming thought is that this is what all people need to enjoy and benefit from. But I understand that it could be provide barriers for some people. And hopefully over time, people who are feeling shame will come to experience what it means to be part of such a vibrant community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra's got the last question. Oh, there's one up the back as well. We could go on and on. Sandra.
My name is Sandra. I am a PhD student at Wake University. And my research is about trying to find ways to improve healthcare to people who are gender diverse in New Zealand. So my question to you, Clive, is in your view, how can healthcare providers play an immediate role in suicide prevention for people who are transgender in New Zealand?
That's a great question, because my view is that people know very little about transgender people, and especially health professionals. So if a trans person wants to access healthcare, and especially some really serious issues around transitioning, there are probably very few people who have the skills in this country to provide the right sort of answers. So I understand there are some specialists to whom people can go, but there are very few on the ground. So the more we can upskill the health force, the health professionals and people working in the health sector, the more we can upskill them, the better. And I think we go back 25 years, there was invisibility around transgender issues. It's becoming more and more a topic of conversation. And if that momentum continues, then hopefully we will see many of the health issues addressed. But it's like many minorities are often sent to the margins and excluded from mainstream services. So we have to work to bring people into the fold, and that's why your work is so important, and it's tremendous. I saw yesterday that there were 10 people were awarded Rutherford Fellowships, which amount to $800,000 for one person to do research over 5 years. And one of those projects is on transgender issues. And I can't imagine that would have ever happened 25 years ago. But it's fortunate that people are now starting to see that there is real need in this area and providing resources to address that need. And that reminds me of that sheet I passed around and we were going to talk about, and I was going to give you an opportunity to discuss it. But that sheet outlines many of the issues that need to be, many of the action points that we need to consider if we're going to address this point. One last question up the back, if it's brief.
I've been a teacher here for the past 11 years. And from day one of my teaching, you know, it was sort of stumbling and falling and getting up and crawling and, you know, getting big resistance from our medical students. But over the years, I've always included trans takatāpui content. And I do that by way of inviting young people who are willing to tell their stories, because their stories cannot be challenged. And so getting it from the horse's mouth is a critical way of teaching doctors of the future. I teach 4th and 5th year medical students and have some ongoing involvement with trainee interns. So really our role as teachers is to join the dots and get those relationships working so that the voices that have been suppressed, hitherto been suppressed, can be, can be amplified. And so week before last was the last 4th year Māori public health session with 18 medical students. And we had 4 young takatāpui, 1 queen, 2 that identify as transgender, and 1 very out there radical lesbian feminist Māori. And so they were able to just say, look, this is our experience. And I watched the students and I listened to those who ask the questions and have the inquiring mind. And I listened to the responses to their questions and their comments. And there is no better way I believe, to teach our doctors and our medical specialists, endocrinologists, psychiatrists, because, you know, we all know being takatāpui is a form of mental illness in this westernized, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, racist health system that we have. Look, I'm starting to preach now, eh? But yeah, so anyone here who would like to participate in lectures in the future, even just to sit in and see what our students say in response to the kōrero from our young trans adult.
That's okay. I think we're going to have to close. Can I just have the last word and say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this issue that is of some importance to all of us. And I'm mindful of the fact that had I come here 20 odd years ago, I wouldn't have been able to talk with such expansiveness, because I've gone away and I've understood and learned a lot more about life and about the world than I would have when I had just newly graduated. So it's wonderful to come here. It's wonderful to see one of my supervisors here. So and it's great to see you still taking notes, Philippa. You must have a library full of those. I'd just like to thank you, and thank you, Kerry, for inviting me. But I'd also like you to convey to the head of this school, the dean, that I'm very grateful to have been issued with an invitation to come and talk to you. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.